What's up, you mob? Welcome to this episode of the Goss, where I sit down with my father, sit down with my old man, and talk about this week's Goss. The news, current affairs, what's going on in our lives, everything like that. So these episodes are all about talking about a wide range of different topics to allow you guys to hear all sorts of different vocabulary, to form your own opinions about these topics as well, and to hear conversations, natural conversations amongst native speakers of English and how we interact with one another. Now, if you guys want access to the full videos, the full episodes, the full transcripts, as well as the premium podcast player so that you can listen to the episode and read the text at the same time, don't forget to sign up for the premium podcast at aussieenglish.com.au. And you will also get access to all of that and more if you join the Academy, which includes hundreds of courses, 3 times weekly classes with a real English teacher, amongst many other things. So guys, go check that out. In today's episode, which has been split up into 2 episodes, so you'll probably get one this week and one next week, we talk about a wide range of different topics. We talk about family history and a really interesting story in my family with my father and his parents, how they met. And yeah, I'll let you listen to that story. It's a very interesting one. We talk about New Zealand's Prime Minister and why she is probably the best Prime Minister in the Western world. We talk about pokies and why they have been shut in Australia and how much money they're saving people every single day at the moment whilst they're closed. We talk about Chernobyl and that there was a massive fire near Chernobyl causing radiation levels to increase like crazy. We also talk about a mutant enzyme that is being used now to break down plastic bottles and help recycle plastics. We also touch on a few of these COVID stories as they're sort of happening in and amongst these other stories we talk about. And then lastly, we talk about a supermarket boss from the supermarket chain called Drake's in South Australia and what he did when a certain hoarder asked for a refund for 5,000 rolls of toilet paper. Anyway, guys, without any further ado, let's get into this episode, kick the kookaburra, and let her rip. Before I get into the other stories that I had here, that's just made me think about COVID and how many different laws are being implemented by different countries around the world. Are you worried at all about countries like ours, Australia, implementing certain restrictive laws that will then later not be repealed?
Not so much restrictive laws, but one of the stories I was going to throw in was this idea that the government have come up with an app that came out of Singapore.
Yeah.
An app that will, by Bluetooth connections, will trace your social connections, even if you are not physically touching, speaking to, having anything else to do with people. But if you're in the same proximity, and Bluetooth has a distance thing of 10 or 15 meters, maybe more in the right conditions.
This was an app that effectively read your Bluetooth to see how many other phones were around you that stayed within 15 minutes. Yes, so they had to have stayed within contact for 15 minutes and then it would register it, and the government could use that to track people you've come in contact if you end up having COVID, right?
Yeah, that's it. And Singapore, which is a much more restricted state in the loosest sense than Australia is, only had a 20% uptake. And the Australian government are coming out saying, look, we think this will only work if we have a 40% uptake, but we would encourage everybody to do it. And look, for me, this again is a solution. I know. And I just said, Joe and I, your mother and I were talking about this last night when it came up on the news. And I just said, there's only one answer to this. It's 2 words. 3 of the letters are F, and you can fill in the rest. There is no chance that, I reckon I'd be surprised if we get 4%, let alone 40% of Australians taking this up.
Christ.
And it's one of those things where it's a technical solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And so this is how you get, and all due respect to my IT and engineering friends, this is the solution you get when you give an engineer or an IT engineer a problem. They take all of the social aspect out of it, and they come up with an IT solution. Yep, we understand Bluetooth. Here's a way that'll do it. And we understand how apps work. We'll write an app that will just suck all of your Bluetooth data out and make contacts with. And as long as everybody's registered, we'll know exactly who you came in proximity with ever. And ideally, that's a nice way of saying we need to know. If somebody is infected with COVID, then who do they come in contact with over the last 2 weeks and being able to tell? Nice idea, but you cannot impose such an enormous privacy violation on people.
Yeah, talk about 1984, right?
Yeah,
Just Big Brother watching you.
Even if it was reasonable in this extreme circumstance, and I can't imagine a circumstance that could be much more extreme than the one we're currently in with regard to disease, even if it were reasonable then, how's this going to be turned off?
Mm.
Yes. Are you going to does deleting the app help? Are they actually plugging something in to your phone? And this is a bit conspiracy theorist, but if you can write an app that'll do it, you can write an app that'll suck that code straight into the phone, and you can delete the app and it's still doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Your first-year IT student will be able to do that. And so...
Well, you wonder too, if we're having these conversations in countries like Australia, what is going on in places like China and Russia and some of these more authoritarian countries? Where the government
Brazil,
has carte blanche to enter whatever it wants, and you just, deal with it. Yeah, so you worry because there are certain things that we've talked about in the past. I think the foreign car tax that was brought in because the Australian government didn't want the cars that were being built in Australia, the companies that worked here, to be directly affected by imports. After the car industry in Australia is completely closed down and everything is built overseas, those car imports are still on all of the foreign cars.
Yeah, we're still paying the same tax.
Yeah, any car, I think once it's above $60,000, it's pretty much $90,000. Yeah, right. So
you can't buy a car for $70,000 in Australia. Yeah.
So are there any things that could come in that you're worried about that would affect life after this?
I'm actually, other than things like the app, where it's not so much laws, because laws can always be changed. You have another election and the laws will get changed. It's more the acceptance of and apologies to George Orwell, the Big Brother approach to government of monitoring their citizens and violating privacy that seem to be acceptable under extreme circumstances. But once those extreme circumstances go away, those things just don't disappear. They just become the norm. That's what I'm more worried about. I'm actually less worried about legislation. In terms of general behaviour and stuff, it'll be interesting is probably an understatement, but it will be interesting to see what happens with just general behaviour. I
was going to ask you that too. How much do you think this pandemic is going to change the way in which societies interact within themselves? Because I was listening to, what's his name? He was on Joe Rogan recently. He's an atheist from the US. Michael Shermer.
Oh, yeah.
All right. So Michael Shermer was on Joe Rogan recently talking about this, and he was talking about some research that was done on societies who are loose versus tight societies. So a society like Japan is a very tight society. Germany is a very tight society where people conform to the rules. They do as they're expected, and there's kind of these tight rules throughout society that everyone conform to. Loose societies are sort of the opposite. So Australia is relatively loose in terms of being relaxed, and he was bringing up a lot of information about that and how tighter societies that say don't hug and kiss one another, and they have these, Japan, they bow to one another. They're handling the virus better, and that this may bleed on into the future in terms of how our societies now react to this, and you may end up with a shift towards tighter societies. So what do you think will happen in the wake of coronavirus in terms of human behaviour or social and cultural aspects of different societies?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to most affect people who are children and teenagers in terms of their behaviour, because this event is going to have had a much more significant effect on their view of life than it does for you, and particularly for people of my age. Yeah, in general, we're all being treated the same, but if you go back and imagine if this had happened when you're in, say, primary school and the effect that this has had. You can't go to school anymore. That every time you see anything, people are talking about, don't go near other people, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands, don't touch your face.
To interrupt you there, I was almost brought to tears the other day by watching a video of a nurse or a doctor coming home from work, and his son runs up to him wanting to give him a hug, and he can't.
He says,
He's like,
no.
he says, no, and then he breaks down crying on the ground.
Yeah.
And you're just like, oh, man. It's just
so I think it's going to have an effect, and not necessarily a good effect, at least in the short to medium term. But in the longer term, I think it'll be. And P.Z. Myers used to joke about, if they were writing 10 commandments, where was wash your hands as one of them? Moses got it wrong. I think that just general idea of things that we can just do as a habit to reduce the transmission of disease. I think it'll just become habit in children, that I think children are just going to wash their hands more, as an example. I think the other thing that it may do, and probably not in the long term, because these shock things tend to have an effect for a short term, but not necessarily forever, is that people will realise what they can give up and what they can live without. If you're sitting at home, you're not out spending money. Now, this is going to affect our economy as well, but you're not out buying things that you don't need. You'll work out what do I need to survive is now going to be obvious to you, whereas previously people treated luxuries as requirements for survival. So I think
do you think this is kind of
that.
Winding people back in and getting them to focus on what's really important?
Yeah.
So that's a sort of positive aspect.
And even the environment. Well, I think the negative effects are going to be that there will be a lot less social contact. I mean, we are social beings. We're social animals. There have been studies done for 100 years or more about the positive effects of touch and hugging. And if people are much more reluctant to do that, I mean, you and I hug when we greet each other and when we part. I'm sure you do, and I know I do that to lots of other people as well.
Well, this sort
we're
of
going to be more reluctant to do that.
This ties in with the tight and loose societies, because you see societies like Germany and Japan, and to us they seem very cold and not very loving and friendly. And looser societies seem to be the opposite, where they tend to be very affectionate and very open and very loving. The same with like Estonia. I remember my friends from Estonia coming to Australia and getting acclimated to culture here, and how they were always like, it's so weird seeing people smile at you and wave at you in the street who don't know you, or just being loud and saying hello and stuff like that. And they go home and no one does that. You're seen as a freak if you smile or look anyone in the eye in the street.
Yeah, and so there are those cultural things are interesting, and this is an aside, but when I was a child and walking around the streets of Melbourne, and even then we had lots of non-European people living in Melbourne, and watching Indian men, for instance, as in from a country India, would walk down the street holding hands, and that was just what they did. There was no implication of any other sexuality in there. It was just that's what they did.
Well, and we see that with Chinese
Asian girls. They will walk around in groups all holding hands, and you just don't see even Australians doing that.
And it's so funny because I remember being at university and being like, God, there's a lot of Asian lesbians here. My friends are like, they're just friends. Jesus,
they're
Pete.
just friends. That's what they do.
Women don't do that unless.
Yeah, I know. I know. And so there's, I think that's going to be one of the consequences. I think there's, and I'm yet to decide whether this is going to be a positive or a negative, because the cynic in me says it's a positive. The realist in me says that it's probably a negative. And that is the distrust we are going to have for governments, not just our own, but governments around the world. There are some governments, and we've already spoken about Jacinda Ardern. Please, Jacinda, retire, resign, and we'll have you in Australia. Jacinda Ardern aside, there have been very few governments, federal governments or governments of countries who have handled this well. South Korea probably is an example of one who has handled it extremely well, to the point where, and again, it's hardly a surprise, the way they're that tight society again, but they also they're the most technologically advanced country in the world, and that's what they rely on, and they rely on their people and their technology. And as soon as this came in, they didn't impose isolations on people. They didn't impose, this sort of 1.5 metre social distancing or any of that sort of stuff. They just said, we're going to test everybody.
Yeah.
And they rapidly developed testing protocols and just put them out, so everybody knew who had the virus. And so, but that, when we look at what's happened in Italy, in Spain, in the UK, in the United States, who knows what's happening in China? I think we've always had a fairly cynical view of China. So take them out of the equation. I think this. Why do
they do that? I think you would imagine that the CCP, the government of China, would do that because they want to maintain control, not just internally but externally. Right?
Externally, yeah.
They don't want to lose face.
Yeah. They don't. Firstly, there's a cultural thing that they don't want to lose face, and that's a huge thing in Asian culture. And it used to be the gag of, and I've only been to Hong Kong twice, but used to be the gag when you go to Hong Kong is don't ask anybody for directions, because they will never tell you that they don't know. They'll just point somewhere and because they would rather lie to you and tell you they don't
like
know.
A fool.
Yeah.
And whereas it's so funny because my way would be make sure that you tell, it's probably because I'm a scientist as well, but it's acknowledge what you don't know so that you don't look like an idiot when you get it wrong and people can point out that you're wrong. And that's why I think people get really irritated with scientific answers quite a lot, especially in the media and science communication, because they'll use a lot of these, I think, quite often adverbs and adjectives to say they're unsure about certain things, or it's probable, it's likely, it's possible, and it's because they've been trained not to be definitive, because you're almost certainly going to be wrong.
And the media wants absolutes. They want an answer, and B, they'd rather it was the wrong answer, because then it becomes a controversy, and then it's news. Good news is not news. So
we can move on.
I don't know. What do you think
of
that? What are you afraid of
in terms of the virus?
No, not the virus itself, but the outcomes of. Let's assume that we all get over this, and we will, one way or another, as a society, we will get over this.
I think
it might take weeks or months.
My
or years,
biggest fear would be that it has a lasting change in terms of how people interact with one another and see one another, because you already feel this walking down the street of just like, ooh, be careful of that. Oh, they got too close to me, and I don't like seeing that in myself. I miss, maybe it was ignorant though, and it is harmful to some extent, not having that sort of appreciation for the fact that people transmit colds and diseases that way. But it was kind of a nice place to live, kind of like, back in your day, I imagine, when kids could go out and play in the street at the age of 5 without supervision, and you were kind of like, whatever, they'll be fine. And then you have a handful of stories of children going missing or being murdered, or pedophiles, and all of a sudden no one lets their kids outside unsupervised until the age of 13 or 14, even though statistically the problem isn't actually any greater, and if anything it's probably less than it was back then. But you have this fear that's there, right? And not even just the fear, the judgment and condemnation from other people if you do that.
Look, I've just been writing my chapter of the family history story, and writing about, and I've used the line in one paragraph of the most common question in our house was, what's for dinner? The second most common question was, can we go to the beach? Because we lived in a beachside suburb and within walking distance of the beach. And from about the age of 8, Mum would just say, yes, off you go. And so my friends and I would just go to the beach and jump on our bikes at 9 or 10 and go herring around the cliff tops and creating havoc. There's no chance that even when you were 8 years old, if you'd said, can I go to the beach, I would have said, yes, I'll take you. There never would have been, just grab your surfboard and run off down to the beach. So, you weren't 8 years old when we lived here, but that's. Do
you feel sorry that that's the case?
I do. I understand why it's happened, and I would feel horrified. And so myself.
It comes back to something though too, where you can only imagine. Okay, so imagine that 99 out of 100 times it's going to be fine, but there's the one time that it isn't. How will I live with myself if that happens?
Exactly. But at the same time, I look back on my childhood very fondly of effectively having the beach as my backyard, and I can't imagine a childhood without that. But you didn't have that childhood, even when you were growing up at the same age in the forest. We wouldn't let you. Oh, you just go down to the forest by yourself.
No chance.
No. So anyway.
Radiation levels rise as a fire burns through Chernobyl's former nuclear power plant, or at least close to it, not through, near.
No, near.
So there was a
there'll be a whole lot of
fire.
radiation fallout that'll be buried in the ground that is now being, released as just by, thermal.
Well, it's in the stuff that's burning, so it just gets sent up into the atmosphere. But there's a large forest fire in an area surrounding the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and it's raised radiation levels to really dangerous levels. It's been going for 10 days. They've had hundreds of firefighters, planes and helicopters trying to put it out, and it got within 2 kilometres of the power plant. And it was believed to have been lit. I don't know if it was intentionally by 2 different people, or that they were just idiots and were burning grass and then couldn't put it out. But it was human caused, obviously, and it's a radiation risk that's been causing these excessive levels of radiation. I wanted to ask you, I guess, why is a fire around a decommissioned nuclear power plant a problem?
Well, I think you've just answered the question yourself. And look, this is not just a decommissioned nuclear power plant. This one was never decommissioned. This one was
self-decommissioned.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you want to talk about that first, I guess? Sorry to interrupt you, but the year's 1986 and Chernobyl melts down. What was that experience like for you learning about that, and what happened?
Well, yeah, it was the thing on the news every night. It wasn't quite COVID-19, but because there were other stories, but it was the first line on the news for months. When it was actually happening, we didn't hear much about it because very little information was getting out of Russia, the Soviet Union at the time.
Yeah, the USSR, right?
Yeah, but we were hearing about it, and then there were 2 or 3 events around the world at about the same time, which never got to the point of Chernobyl. But so it had been on the radar of news of nuclear power has a negative side, and this is the risk of the things going wrong in the power plant.
It's so frustrating though, right? Because have you seen the TV show Chernobyl?
Yeah, I have.
So I watched that, but then I also watched a breakdown of the TV show to see how accurate it was, because the ironic thing is they have a woman on the show who's the scientist.
Yeah, she was representing a whole lot of people.
She was representing about 20 different people. They're like, we're not going to have that many characters.
No,
but it just goes to show that whole show effectively shed a light on how much ignorance and arrogance caused this thing in the first place. And then the cover-up was effectively based on the fear of people under the Soviet Union, the leaders just not wanting to be the bearer of bad news to their person above them, who effectively would just say, this is not a problem. This will not be a problem. You're going to deal with this, or you're dead.
Exactly.
And it seems somewhat reminiscent, right, of China and the COVID virus, where these authoritarian groups are just hoping that they can just quash something that's not going to be a bigger problem, and it's like, if it is later, we'll deal with it. But what happened when that came out? Did you guys at first just think, oh, there's been this horrible accident, and then find out what happened, or did it take years for the truth to come out?
No, it was pretty obvious what was happening within days and weeks. In a sense of, it has taken years and decades to get to the real truth of, where the individual, because a lot of the individuals who were directly involved died very quickly by exposure.
It
and
was
a lot
tragic.
of the others were just shuffled off into prisons in Siberia, ostensibly because they screwed up. But the real reason, as you said, was it's a cover-up.
Well, and it's so fucking annoying, because you watch the TV show and you just see how many heroes there were. You watch the docos and you see how many of these Ukrainians threw themselves into eternity by going and doing something to try and save the lives of their countrymen, like the miners who had to go.
Yeah, they knew they were going to die.
Or whatever.
They were told they were going to die, and they volunteered anyway.
Well, that's it. And you just and the firefighters, you're just like, Jesus Christ, and they were all dead within days or weeks.
And look, there's a. That's an aside to the original question about the dangers of nuclear power plants and fire, but I think there is an aside to human nature that is unfathomable outside of those sort of emergencies. If you look at September 11, where you have police and fire people. I'm getting emotional just talking about it.
I remember
who are
hundreds
running
of them
into
dying.
buildings, knowing they're going to die, but hoping to save people.
Yeah. We lost 400, right? Or America lost 400 in the buildings who were just trying to save people.
Who weren't in the buildings to start with. They went in after it had happened. And so, I think there are those elements of people just look at it and go, it's my time, step up. Funnily enough, there aren't many politicians who would do the same. They're the ones running down the back door and shredding the documentation on the way out the building. But
well, and they showed that with Chernobyl. I think it tended to be the average Joe was doing all of the saving.
Little guys who were
and the guys at the top were just trying to make sure they saved their job.
For it.
Yeah, but it is crazy in terms of the fallout.
Well, this is the fallout of the fallout now, because we've got the.
Hey, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or Academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below, or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.